Welcome to the Raised a Rebel podcast. I'm Katie, and this is my dad. And today we're going to be talking about the Constitution. We're going to just give a brief overview of the history behind it, and then dive into some of the actual text and the framework of how it's put together. So to jump into the history, before we had the Constitution, we had the Articles of Confederation, which obviously didn't last too long. So let's talk about what were some of the shortcomings of the Articles of Confederation and why did we end up needing to replace them?
So basically, as a fledgling country, we had separated from Great Britain, and I think the Articles of Confederation were just the quick means to hastily put together a structure of a government. And really, I think we knew the designers of what would become the Constitution knew that it was temporary, right? It was just a way to get everybody organized, get everybody moving in the same direction, knowing that they needed a more permanent fix to establish a government. And I think that's where the Constitution came in, where you have so much of that Constitution that delineates, what is the government? What does it do? How is it organized? And I think those Articles of Confederation were just that first attempt of we have to have something in place. And, we use that analogy of building an airplane while it's flying. That's what they were doing. They were already in the air and putting it together as they went.
So you think that they intended for the Articles of Confederation to be a temporary piece of law?
I mean, if you look at the Articles themselves, I think so. I don't think the articles were complete enough or addressed enough of the issues or the complexities of what the government needed in place at that point. Could it have been done? Yeah, but I think when you look at some of Madison's work and you look at some of the history behind it, I think they went into it knowing that it was temporary. Maybe they wouldn't have admitted it because of political reasons. But if you start going through it, there's gaps.
Interesting. And what are some of those gaps? I mean, the first one that usually comes to my mind is they had no way of collecting their own taxes, right? So this fledgling country is trying to pay off the debt of having a major war, and Washington's one of his final requests when he left office and handed it over to Congress was just that they pay his troops, right? Mm-hmm. Well, they can't really pay his troops if they can't get any money to pay off their debt. And because they had no authority under the Articles of Confederation to collect that money, all of the funding for the government was coming from tariffs, and they couldn't actually have a federal tariff. The tariffs were all just by state. A lot of the Articles of Confederation divvied up the power very much on a state-to-state basis and had a very weak federal government.
Well, and I think that was needed early on to get the states on board. They didn't want to immediately replace the lordship and the bureaucracy of Great Britain with another government, right? You always hear the quote, why would I trade, one tyrant 3,000 miles away for 3,000 tyrants a mile away? Right. And I think the idea was we're going to organize all these states and we're going to give it this very weak structure, knowing that had to evolve. And I mean, when I look at the Articles of Confederation, in my mind, there's no way that you could convince me somebody could honestly say they intended that to be permanent.
Interesting. So another one of the shortcomings of the Confederation that comes to mind for me is its amendability. I believe that they had to have a unanimous decision to add an amendment or any sort of change to it. And at the time, they were struggling to even get their delegates to all come together, right? That was the other thing, is you have a weak government that can't fund itself. You have a government that's very hard to make any change in law, and it's relatively not the greatest written, right?
And you also have one vote, one state.
Yes.
And so right from the get-go, there's friction.
Right.
right? There's just no way that one vote, one state amongst, I mean, realistically, it was a league of states.
Yeah.
It wasn't a functioning government as we see today.
Right. But then on top of all of that, not even being able to get your delegates to all come and even show up, like it really was very dysfunctional, which allowed for Shays Rebellion to happen, which was one of the major events that pushed the government to have to put together the Constitution and make them all really say, this isn't working. And Shays Rebellion, correct me if I'm wrong, was basically this guy, last name was Shay, that's where we get the name, came and didn't he raid a court or something? It had to do with breaking into a courthouse.
An arsenal,
okay.
Which would have been a storage of munitions, powder, ball, all that kind of stuff.
Gotcha. And then, so he was protesting high taxes and harsh debt collection under the Articles of the Confederation, which is interesting since that tax wasn't even really coming from the federal government, is my understanding, since they didn't have a way to collect taxes on their own. It was all the states.
They didn't have a way to do it, but then also a lot of the people that fought in the Revolutionary War hadn't been paid yet. So all these loans are coming due, these farmers, and they still haven't been paid. Right. So you've got a pretty good crisis on your hands.
Well, and they've all been built up with this mindset of the rebellion and, bloodshed being okay for the price of justice. So they're in this mindset of wanting to rebel. And then when the Articles of Confederation aren't cutting it, well, what do you expect they do? And this overview also points out that the farmers did force the courts to close, preventing foreclosures. And then the attack on the armory was like the high point of it.
It was, they were looking for weapons. They wanted to continue to push the rebellion.
So then, as a result of that, we got together the Constitutional Convention, and there's where they really started to hash out what this new Constitution is going to look like. You had your Virginia plan and your New Jersey plan. Basically, the Virginia plan, since Virginia was a very big state, was wanting more of a straight-up democracy, right? Every person has equal authority in their vote, whereas the New Jersey plan would be more based on the states, right? Every state has an equal number of votes. That way, a large state like Virginia wouldn't be able to overwhelm other states simply because they have a much higher population. Obviously, we ended up with compromising between the two, which is why you end up having every state has 2 senators, and
bicameral House. Yep.
The number of representatives they have is based on population. So we end up with a bit of both. I believe part of that was also played into the formation of the Electoral College. Mm-hmm. It's that same idea where we have popular vote, but it also comes down to a set number of electors, and each state's number of electoral votes they get is based off of that number of senators and representatives in Congress.
Well, you got to stop and put yourself in that time. We talk about historical prevalence, and there had to be a negotiation between the states and the people that were putting this together, these founding fathers, of how to best represent these 13 states. Especially when you start looking at, Manifest Destiny, which would come into play later, and the expansion of the United States. The forefathers knew that rapid development in the country was going to happen. And how do we balance this need for what I'll say the underwriters of the revolution, because
Right.
you've got, the landholders, the people with the money, the influence, the founding fathers. They want their representation. They want to maintain some form of influence and power with a country and states that know that, commerce is one of the biggest challenges. Interstate and international commerce. The colonies are an economic engine. And so how do we frame a government and a constitution that can take those economics and that diversity into account? And I don't want to necessarily say level the playing field, because, you brought up Virginia, the tobacco trade and all these different things that are money sources for the colonies, this fledgling nation. And how do we make that work? And so when I look at the Constitution, I see them, yes, we're forming the bones of a government, but they're also looking at this commerce engine and how do we frame this so that one state doesn't end up with a monopoly over everybody else.
Right. Which is what was starting to happen with Virginia, because they were also, even at this early point in our history, starting to spread out into the West. West of what they were at, and then
Pennsylvania, Virginia, and
right.
I think if you look at it too, like we hear a lot of talk about the Ohio Valley.
Yes, that's what I'm referring to.
I mean, they want to push west. They understand, the resources that are available, both, from what we see as natural resources, but just the land. Yeah. There was so much value in land that people were, promised. You have instances where land was being sold multiple times by the same person, the typical Ponzi scheme. But, land was what the nation was going to be built on and fortunes were going to be built on. And so I see a lot of that in the Constitution of trying to balance all those desires and that commerce for future trade.
For sure. Just to kind of recap this little summary of the history, I think it's interesting if you look into it, the average lifespan of a constitution for, different countries who put together constitutions similar to ours is only 17 to 19 years. And as of this year, our constitution has been the law of the land for 250.
I'm kind of excited about that. I mean, it's going to be a fun year. We're already starting to see some celebratory stuff come out. Kind of looking forward to it.
For sure. It's just pretty amazing when you look at it and realize, like, we really are the exception to that rule of 17 to 19 years. So let's dig into some of the framework of the Constitution and what it is about the text that allows it to be such a long-standing, reputable document that has built a government that can be so effective while also being restrained. So, of course, that starts off with your preamble.
So, section one's pretty quick.
Yeah, we don't need to dig into
it. It sets up Congress. Essentially says there's going to be a Senate and a House. Section 2 gets into the House of Representatives, breaks down how they're...
Oh, sorry, you're still on Article 1, though.
Yes.
Right.
Section 2 is House of Representatives, breaks down the prerequisites, what it takes to be elected, talks a little bit about taxes, which we get into. Some of that end up getting changed over time.
Right.
Vacancies. So really, those first couple sections set forth what that government's going to look like. Section 3 is the Senate, talks about how each person will be elected, how to serve, how to replace. A lot of the Constitution to me is they're taking care of business.
Yeah.
Right. They're sitting down. They're knocking out the basics of what we need as a framework. Section 4 is elections. Section 5 is the powers and duties of Congress. And now this is interesting because we'll talk about the Articles or the Bill of Rights later. And there was a big argument by Madison against a Bill of Rights when this was coming up because he felt like Section 5, along with some of the other Constitution, delineated the powers of the government enough that we didn't need a Bill of Rights.
Interesting.
And was essentially saying that because they limited the powers of Congress and the government, that a Bill of Rights wasn't needed. And there was a lot of pushback against that.
Yeah, because isn't it, it lists the powers and duties of Congress, but then also includes the clause how is it phrased? It's the necessary or so it basically says here's a list of things that Congress is allowed to do. They can't do anything outside of this. And then it kind of just
So that would be Section 8. So we're jumping ahead a little bit.
Okay, sorry.
Into the powers of Congress, and that breaks down, there's clauses. So they call it about the tax clause, the commerce clause, declare war, necessary and proper cause is where you're getting to. And then the spending clause. And so that's the section that really breaks out, okay, here's the daily activities, and I hate to say daily when it comes to war, but here's the daily activities of Congress, right? This is what they're allowed to do. And a lot of that, post offices, roads, it establishes the Supreme Court or tribunals that are inferior to the Supreme Court, piracies, felonies, declare war, letters of marque and reprisal, to raise and support armies, but there was no money longer than a term of 2 years to support that. So there was a lot of fear about a standing military force. So, Section 8 is quite long because it goes in there. But then Section 9 gets into it and talks about, the powers that are denied Congress. And that's kind of the other side of the coin of here's what Congress can't do. And I like how they outline, here's your jobs, here's what you're not allowed to do. Right. And some of that gets into, the slave trade, habeas corpus, direct and indirect taxes, export, appropriations, a lot of foreign relations stuff in there.
Yeah. So essentially Article 1 as a whole, all of its sections included, establishes the legislative branch. And then moving on to Article 2, and we can just kind of run through these a little quicker, is the executive branch. So that's primarily the president and all of the details regarding his election and his vice president and everything related to the executive branch. Article 3 is the judicial branch, establishes the Supreme Court. At this point, it does not give the court the power for judicial review, which is now one of its primary authorities, but that would come later, really being set by precedent in the Mayberry v. Madison case later on. Then on to Article 4, deals with states' citizenship and the establishment of new states. Article 5 is the amendment process, which fixes what we said was one of the issues with the Articles of Confederation, is that there was no way to feasibly
modify
change it. So it kind of, it didn't work, and it was stuck that way. And then Article 6 deals with debts, supremacy, oaths, and religious tests, which is interesting, and I haven't dug into Article 6 that much. Definitely not as much as the other ones. And then Article 7 is just the ratification of all of that.
It says just need 9 out of the 13 to make a law. Yep.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the Constitution, and we know it's not a perfect document right out of the gate.
Right.
Because, even to get this ratified, there's discussion of amendments and a Bill of Rights. And originally proposed, the Bill of Rights was 17. They ended up with what? The Senate approved 12, and 10 went on to be ratified. And so right out of the gate, that there's a lot of give and take. There's a lot of negotiation going on here, what's going to make it and what isn't. Right. And if I bring that forward to modern political times, look how hard it is to pass a budget. Right? We've talked about that.
Yeah.
And they were able to push through the foundation of a government that's survived 250 years in less time than it's taken us as a nation to pass a budget.
Well, and as far as a budget goes, they hardly had one at this point, right? Because they're dealing with, again, the repercussions of running a war, and then also the repercussions of dealing with the post-war crisis without much funds because the Articles of Confederation had left them at such a low point. So one more quick topic I want to get into is, like you said, when the Constitution was being drafted, it kind of had this understanding of it's not complete, we're going to add the Bill of Rights and amend it however many times, right? But there's still a good portion of the Constitution that is up for interpretation. How much do you think the way that you view the Constitution can change its meaning, I guess? We see this mostly, I feel like, in the justice system is where you'll hear constitutional interpretation. Typically, it's some people, I would say I prefer to view the Constitution through an originalist interpretation, thinking through, what would the founders have meant when they wrote this?
Well, I think too, you have to understand that the DNA was inherited from British law, right? Because yes, they had a king, but it was a constitutional monarchy, right? You have the House of Lords, you have the House of Commons. So to frame this in perspective, the English view on law was what you would call, I think, judicial review. That the law is changing. The law can change. And I think you have parts of our government that look at this and say, over time, we're going to have to change to keep up with, expanding. We talked about manifest destiny.
Yeah.
We talked about, at that point, they were thinking about, well, maybe we're going to incorporate Canada. That's discussed by some of the representatives of can we bring some of them on as states? So there's a lot going on here. And I think the fact that you have a Bill of Rights passed so quickly after the Constitution shows you that they knew that through the legal framework, the Constitution was going to change over time.
Right. So I would say, to kind of follow up with my argument for originalism, is viewing the Constitution through an originalist interpretation means that you believe change in the law must be made through formal amendment, whereas living constitutionalism is another one you'll hear, is the idea that the document is just this sort of collection of ideals, and it kind of ebbs and flows with culture. So what it meant back in the day when they wrote it might not be what it really means now.
See, and that's where you start losing me.
That's pretty wishy-washy.
That's where you get my disagreement.
I agree.
And we're going to talk about some of the amendments. We're going to start off in the next podcast with the First Amendment. We're going to get into the Second Amendment. And there's some arguments in there to say, this no longer applies. And I have a really hard time with that, because while technology changes and culture changes, the intent of, I'll call them laws that were passed, it's the intent remains the same.
Yep.
And I think you see that as a thread through this entire document is, the thread, the DNA, whatever you want to put your finger on, remains pretty constant.
Right. Well, it's that whole idea of, the culture and your circumstances can be changing, and obviously they have since the founding of our nation. But what has stayed the same is the contrast between good and evil and human nature, right?
Well, I would throw one more in there. I would say that universal protect the people from the government, because everything that you read in here, even when it's delineating what our government structure is going to look like, it's putting in safeguards to protect the people from the government. And if you're a population that just came out of a war with Britain over this heavy-handed, control over every aspect of your life, that was the number one concern, is they wanted their freedom. They had just fought a bloody battle, street to street to gain this freedom. They don't want to hand that over to somebody else. And so I think that's the current you see through it. And so when we start going through the amendments that come in here, whether it's the Bill of Rights or the other ones, there's that protection. And I think as we go through time, we see less and less of that in the culture, and we want to get more and more, I'm not even sure how to put it, but caught up on how modern times have changed and how it doesn't apply anymore. I think there's that argument, and I'm 180 degrees of that. I think that thread is still there of freedom. in every single aspect of this document.
I think so too. I think we can, like you said, we can definitely see otherwise in the Constitution, but as far as we can see otherwise in the culture, but the Constitution definitely still holds that element of valuing freedom. One more, kind of the final main constitutional interpretation that's thrown around is based on precedent. In previous instances, how have people, whether that's the courts, Congress, the president, whatever, how have they interpreted this aspect of the Constitution? And I think precedent can be a very valid thing to look into and consider when making decisions. But, if you set the precedent by a bad decision, you have to have that that solid foundation, which is our Constitution, to fall back on and say, and I mean, we've seen it in our courts, right? One of the really big Supreme Court cases that we'll get into on a next episode when we talk about the First Amendment, basically is a guy who says, I should be allowed to do this even though it breaks the law because it still is in accordance with my rights and freedoms based in the Constitution. And we see this all the time, is someone breaks the law and then they claim that the law was unconstitutional, right? And so I definitely think originalism is the most secure way to view the Constitution. I mean, there's arguments for and against it, but...
Well, we can go back to our discussion on fallacies. There's that sunk cost fallacy, where somebody has invested so much into a certain direction, even when they find evidence to the contrary, they're afraid to deviate from that course. And I think constitutional law kind of heads that way sometimes. And you talk about precedent. Have we seen bad precedents set in law? Yes. Yeah. But at what point do people pull back and say, that was a bad decision, we need to change from it? Instead, you see people jump all in and keep pushing it, even though they'll admit, it's imperfect.
Yeah.
Then why are we chasing it?
Because people hate being wrong.
Yes, that's where it gets down to.
Right. Well, are there any other kind of concluding thoughts you have about the Constitution?
That's all I've got on this part. I know that we're going to get into the Bill of Rights. There's a lot to cover here. We are not constitutional scholars by any means, but it's a period in history that I love, and I really enjoy having that discussion with you because of the course that your life is going to take, and to be able to have these times. And yeah, we're recording for a podcast right now, but this is not unlike the discussion we have in our living room sometimes, where something will come up on the news or something will be, texted to us by a friend, and we get into this. And the next thing you know, I've got, 3 or 4 people in my family sitting here on the iPhone doing constitutional research and having this discussion. And, your sister will jump in at 15 years old and she'll have another idea that comes in. So I just like the fact that we're able to reproduce this on a podcast, have that discussion. And you'll see us sometimes pick up our phone and start looking at stuff or the laptop. We're not scholars. We're here to learn. Right. We love it. And I love having this discussion. And by no rights am I ever 100% correct on anything. But I enjoy having you as a conversationalist to be able to talk that stuff through.
For sure. I really enjoy it as well. And with that, thank you guys for listening to our podcast today. Tune in next time. I think we're going to start breaking down and going through each of the amendments.
Bill of Rights.
The Bill of Rights, yeah.
Not all 17. We'll just stick to the 10.
We'll stick with the 10 for now. Maybe we'll get into the others another time.